All right, with Immanuel Kant, we have one of the great thinkers in the modern idealist tradition who has also been influential on education. When we read the Plato selection, interpreted the myth of the cave, there were metaphysical, epistemological, human nature, and ethics implications. In the selection I want to focus on here from Kant's lectures on education, I just want to focus on Kant as an ethicist. We have seen when we read the Plato selection that there was an emphasis on an authoritarian approach to education, on the use of compulsion, on education as a somewhat painful process that we don't necessarily want to do. And in varying degrees, that has been a core theme throughout idealist traditions, both in the religious, traditional religious schools and in the more secular idealistic schools. First, in this selection here, Kant mentions that education is, in addition, of course, to having a cognitive component, most essentially concerned with morality. He is one of those thinkers for whom morality and forming character is the top educational priority, or at least one of the top two, right, educational priorities. The reason in part for that is that on Kant's view, having a good moral character is one of the most important things, if not the most important thing in adult life, and so it should necessarily be so for child's life, but also that he sees the formation of character as a precondition for almost anything else that can happen in education. Kant has a fairly strongly pessimistic view of the original condition of human beings. We are beings dominated by sin and by weakness, and so education has to take this into account seriously from the outset. All right, so first let me read a little bit and then we'll comment and then we'll move on. All right, first, if we wish to form the characters of children, it is of the greatest importance to point out to them a certain plan and certain rules in everything, and that these must be strictly adhered to. For instance, they must have set times for sleep, for work, and for pleasure, and these times must be neither shortened nor lengthened. All right, so the first point here is a certain amount of strictness, a certain amount of set time, a certain amount of scheduling. The scheduling has to come from authoritative source, the parent, right, or the teachers, because in Kant's view, they're naturally undisciplined. They're chaotic. They're more likely to do anything by means of the whim of the moment. So we have to devise a schedule and we have to impose it, right, upon the students. We have to impose it upon them strictly. Children don't take to this very well, but if we're going to teach them, it has to be something that we cannot compromise on. We can't allow deviations, otherwise the natural unruliness of children will be out of control. So we have to get them used to strictness, discipline, top-down authority right from the bat. Now, for children to do so, there's going to be obedience required of them, and that's the thesis that Kant turns to immediately following. Quote, above all things, right, let me pause here. When a philosopher says above all things, right, that's his way of flashing it in neon lights, even though they didn't have neon lights in the 18th century, but, quote, above all things, obedience is an essential feature in the character of a child. All right, so what Kant is signaling here is that the very first thing we have to attend to in education is obedience, getting the child to be obedient. The number one positive character trait is the trait of obedience. And while Kant is a somewhat secularized thinker with great affinities to the religious way of thinking, here we have Kant as a modern thinker, nonetheless hearkening back to the very earliest of the idealist traditions, at least in the Western tradition. If we think back to the book of Genesis in the Bible, the very first story that we have about human beings acting independently is the great sin, And what was the great sin that human beings first engaged in? Well, it was the sin of disobedience, right? So the story there, right from the very beginning of that tradition, is emphasizing that human beings are by nature disobedience. Disobedience is the great sin, and so by contrast, obedience must be the top virtue, or the number one virtue that we have to instill in. There is therefore a continuity with that tradition, and Kant being a more recent exemplar of that. All right, obedience is the important trait here. How do we instill a sense of dutiful obedience in students? That is what Kant turns to next. How are we going to get students to do so? We know that initially we have to put it upon them and make them do it, but that's only a first step. Eventually what we want is for people to internalize an obedient character and to do it themselves properly. So when we start getting inside the minds and spirits of students, how do we get them properly to motivate themselves and to act accordingly?